And we may have a single boundary that floats between those relationships, but those boundaries need to be flexible based on the relationship we have with that person.
Be manly and the legends of humanity. Welcome to the Fellowship of Honourable Men and Women Role Models for Boys and Men, because you have the power to be a man in all its glory.
So here's a really good one, and that's setting personal boundaries and asserting themselves into relationships. And man, I can't even tell you how many times people ask me about boundaries, like how do I set boundaries? How do I set boundaries, right? And just hearing that question, asserting them into a relationship. The first thing that we need to realize is that we cannot assert our boundaries into a relationship. We can't. What we can do is maintain them within a relationship, and that's within ourselves. So my boundary is my boundary. My partner's boundary is their boundary. And hopefully our boundaries line up with each other. But the minute that I try to assert my boundary into the relationship, guess what that's called? That's called control. And so what we have to recognize is that each of us may or may not have boundaries. And so instead of asserting your boundary into another person, help them develop their own boundaries. Help them bring out where they're comfortable. And it might match yours. And that's our perfect relationship, is when your boundaries align with each other. That's awesome. Few people have that, and that's a true connection. But some boundaries have to remain somewhat flexible too. And that's another issue that comes up, is that in relationships, we have various ones. We have relationships with our employers, we have relationships with our friends, and we have relationships with those that we love. And we may have a single boundary that floats between those relationships, but those boundaries need to be flexible based on the relationship we have with that person and how much trust we have with that person. And so creating a boundary, and when we talk about boundaries, we often think hard barricades. No, boundaries are flexible and movable, and they have to be adjusted. And you need to accept that too, that every day I might have to adjust my boundary. Hey, I'm getting to know you better, and so my boundary is going to back off a little bit to allow you in to that personal, the person that's inside. And that's what a boundary does. That boundary surrounds us to protect the vulnerable person that hides within it. And so, and hey, this goes back to the lobster story, right? The lobster is soft inside, and that's the essence of the lobster. And what has it got on the outside? It's got this hard shell that is encasing it and protecting it. But then inside, as you grow, as you mature, as you develop new education and new experiences, sometimes you need to shed that boundary and add a new one, put a new one. And that's what the lobsters do, is when they become uncomfortable inside that boundary or that shell, then they find a safe place to crawl into, and they shed that shell and they start to grow a new one. And then they come out and face the world again. And we as people, we can do that too. We cannot create a boundary, or we shouldn't create a boundary that stops us from growing. We need to have these flexible boundaries that allow us to grow within relationships. And so when it comes to setting personal boundaries and asserting them to relationships, we need to rethink that. It's about, these are my personal boundaries, and they're going to grow with a relationship as a relationship grows. And that growth might be that they back off or they intensify. And we let's say we encounter somebody that okay, here's my boundary. It's like, I'm only going to tell you so much, but then they start sending us the red flags. We need to grow that boundary a little bit more. Okay, wait a minute, back off. and you extend that boundary. But someone that touches our heart and touches our soul, and we can communicate with, well, that boundary has to come back. And if you held that boundary, they would never really truly get to know the person that you are. And I think as men, as highly sensitive men, we have a problem with that. And that we have encased ourselves in this suit of armor that we call a boundary, and that's around our emotions. And that is not to protect us from the outside world. That is to keep the inside world from coming out. That's what that suit of armor, that's what that boundary is. We've encased ourselves with that. And I've heard a lot of wives talk to me and they say, I wish my husband would open up more. And the reality of that is they have to feel comfortable enough and safe enough in order to do that, in order to allow that boundary to grow or to retract. And so bottom line, guys, is that, setting boundaries is healthy, but they need to remain flexible and they need to remain personal. It cannot be casted onto somebody else.
Before you go, you're invited to continue the Be Manly and the Legends of Humanity journey. Subscribe to our YouTube and become a patron, where you can become a courageous crusader, a wise warrior, a daring dynamo, and even an ascending avenger. Here you'll find all the tools to become a man in all its glory. We're honored to walk side by side with you on this extraordinary adventure. Together, we're unleashing the full power of manhood, creating a better world for everyone.